Thanks for joining us for Keeping It Young podcast, conversations about marriage, family, and ministry life. I'm Dave.
And I'm Bethany.
And we are glad you've joined us today. Last week we started a series about communication. Many would call it the art of communication. Some would call it the
language of love.
The language of love. We are very, very convinced that communication is absolutely essential in a happy marriage. Mm-hmm. So let's look together today at part 2, and we'll begin by reviewing a little bit from last week. One of the things I've always noticed is that communication is something that we joke about readily. I saw a little comic strip recently, said, "Hello, 911, it's my husband. Something is wrong with him. He says there's nothing on TV and all he wants to do is talk." And maybe that would warrant some of you calling 911. But if you were with us last week, you would recall that we talked about how that communication is one of God's great gifts to us. Mm-hmm. It's how we show our love. It's how we solve our problems. It's how we communicate our desires. Mm-hmm. And the list goes on and on and on. Communication is one of God's great gifts. We also learned that it's one of the old man issues that we face. Because we have a sin nature, it's somewhat normal for us to struggle with our feelings or with our emotions, if you will.
Right.
And we can respond harshly, unkindly,
irritably, selfishly.
Yes, irritable, grouchy, the whole works. And so all of us have to walk with God. We have to allow the Holy Spirit to lead us and guide us. And I guess I could just pause right here and say, never make excuses for your failure with communication. We can say, well, that's just how I am, or that's just how God made me, or that's just my personality. But if it's damaging your marriage, then I guess, I mean, how else would you say it? Then it's kind of foolish for you to allow that to be a major issue in your marriage. So communication is one of the old man issues that all of us have to face. And we also learned last week that communication is the art of keeping two people on the same page. And Bethany gave us quite a few ideas there, personal, of how we work hard at using our communication to stay on the same page. And if you recall, we talked about that communication is a character issue. If I'm nice to everybody else but a jerk at home, then we've got some real problems. I have some real problems, and my marriage is going to have some real problems as a result of that. And so we talked about that somewhat. It's a matter of making habits and scheduling times of communication. It's also one of the major keys that brought us together. Now, Bethany told you about how we met at a soccer game, but that first meeting was a conversation.
Right.
And we talked, we listened, we laughed. We talked some more, we listened some more, we laughed some more. We were very serious, and communication was the key to all of it. So today we want to go a little further in talking to you about the language of love and this communicating and how that we're to master the art of communication. And to that end, I want to just take some time to talk with you about one of the great books of the Old Testament, and that's the book of Song of Solomon. And Song of Solomon is somewhat debatable. Some would only use the illustrations of Song of Solomon to talk about Jehovah and the nation of Israel and the love relationship there. More popular, perhaps, is that Christ and the church is in view here. If you've ever sung the song, "His banner over me is love," comes from the words of the Song of Solomon. Or "He's the lily of the valley, the bright and morning star." That song comes out of this as well. But really, this is an epic love poem. It is a story of a man and a woman in love, a husband and a wife in love. And there's no doubt about it. You can't read these verses, these chapters, without realizing there's a ton of communication going on. They're flirty, they laugh, they talk, they're serious. They are just continually growing together, and communication is a real key here. For instance, in Song of Solomon, chapter 1 and verse 9, he says, "I have compared thee, O my love, to a company of horses in Pharaoh's chariots." Now, my wife is sitting right here, and probably that's not a comparison she would find attractive. If I said, "Sweetheart, you just remind me of our neighbor's really nice horses."
No.
She probably wouldn't take that real well. So obviously we're in a different culture here. There is something culturally happening here. But he goes on to say, "Thy cheeks are comely with rows of jewels, thy neck with chains of gold." He says, "We will make thee borders of gold with studs of silver." And then she says, "While the king sits at the table, my spikenard sendeth forth the smell thereof. A bundle of myrrh is my well-beloved unto me. He shall lie all night betwixt my breasts. My beloved is unto me as a cluster of camphor in the vineyards of Engedi. And then they get, kind of flirty here almost, and certainly flowery. Behold, thou art fair, my love. Thou art fair, thou hast dove's eyes. Thou art fair, my beloved, yea, pleasant. Also our bed is green, and so forth. But really what's happening here is a wonderful illustration about communication. If I were to give it an overview, and I've read this in other books, so this is not necessarily original to me, but there's no doubt here that he is very personal with his praise. And notice that he's very involved. Mm-hmm. And wouldn't you agree, Bethany Joy, that the couples where both couples make an effort at the communication are the ones that do the best?
Yes.
And we've seen that so many times. Sometimes there's one member of the marriage, or he or she sometimes, and they're more reserved about their communication. Mm-hmm. And yet, if both of you will work on it, if both of you will make efforts, if both of you will put forth the necessary work to communicate, then it'll encourage your marriage and help your marriage to be everything it ought to be. So he's very involved. He's very personal with his praise. And let's just start right there. He does say, I've compared thee to a company of horses in Pharaoh's chariots, which in our culture makes no sense. But in the culture where Solomon would have lived, the horses and chariots coming down the road were beautifully decorated. The horses were meticulously manicured, jewels. They were an illustration of wealth. You could tell by a person's horses and chariots, their status, their wealth, and so forth. So this would have meant a lot more to her to say, there's never been a chariot coming down the road like you. And you remind me of the king's chariots, the most beautiful illustration of wealth that you can find. So basically what he's doing is he's doing two things here. He's telling her that he loves her. I love you. And Bethany and I, one of the things we've noticed in our marriage is that it's important to keep the love alive.
Yes.
And you've got to say it. You've got to say it a lot. And you say, I love you. Bethany's family says it nonstop. It's I was amazed when I first married into her family how often I love you was a normal part of their conversation.
Right.
My family says it. It's not as normal to us, and more so now than it was perhaps younger, at least by my memory. And so here we are. And so, Bethany, talk for just a moment about how men can speak love to their wives. What advice would you give for the men who are listening to us?
Well, I would say, first of all, say those three words, I love you.
Sure.
And not just at a time where you think, uh-oh, I did something. Oh, hun, I love you. But just saying it on a regular basis so that she knows every day that you love her no matter what's going on. I would say also notice things about her, whether she's gotten a new haircut, not recently during COVID-19, but whether she's gotten a new haircut or a new outfit on, or maybe she took special pains with her makeup that day, or even things around the house. Has she added some new decor, or maybe she cooked a special meal? Noticing those things.
Sure.
And just commenting on them. Not in a sarcastic, oh, what did you do sort of way, but in a sincere, wow, you look good today.
Love is sincere.
I love this meal. Where did you get this recipe? Or, oh, I love it when you make this for me. It's my favorite. Just, I would say, noticing things about her would be a great
that's really
way
good
to show that you love her.
So he's very personal with his praise for her. So he's telling her he loves her. And I suppose before we leave this, sweetheart, how could wives let their husbands know? Men and women are different.
They are different.
And so what advice would you give to a wife?
Well, say it. Say, I love you. I would say, again, you can notice things about him. Hey, you look nice today, as he's on his way out the door, going to work. But I would say also be grateful for things he does around the house. A lot of times our men are out and they're working and they're doing things. We don't even get to see everything that they get to do. We have no idea what's going on in their life. We're entrenched in the house, many of us, and we're doing what we have to do.
And sometimes that's the other way too.
Right, and sometimes it's the other way around, and we have no idea what the other one's doing, but being thankful for what you do know. Honey, thank you for working hard for us, for making money so that we can buy groceries, or thank you for helping me set the table tonight, or thank you for working in the yard, or I would say being grateful would probably go a long way.
That's really good. That's really good. So we find out right here in Song of Solomon chapter 1, as they get conversing, that he's very personal with his praise. So he tells her she's loved, and he even tells her she's lovely. He says, thy cheeks are comely with rows of jewels, thy neck with chains of gold. And sometimes we could just read over that and say, well, isn't that nice? But to fully understand this verse, you do have to recognize that in the beginning of the Song of Solomon, she's worried about her appearance. And she has an insecurity about the fact that she's a working girl. And she comments on the fact that when you look at her face, she's tanned. She says, I'm black, I'm dark. And literally, if you had lived in that culture, a woman in the palace was recognized as beautiful because she had pale skin. It said that she's wealthy. She doesn't have to go out and work in the vineyard. She has servants to do that. Her daddy does the work, and she doesn't have to. And so his bride here, or his fiance, some would believe at this point, is very insecure about Solomon is this great man. He's well known. He's a great leader. And all of a sudden, here I am going to be brought into the palace, and the girls are going to look at me and laugh. So she's very insecure. And one of the things I would say right here, we've got to learn to communicate with each other and help each other to overcome our insecurities by our communication. So when he says to her, your cheeks are comely with rows of jewels, he's touching just a little point of her insecurity. He knows what it is. I found that very interesting. He knows her so well that he knows she's insecure about her tan. We might say about her farmer's tan. She's insecure about that farmer's tan or those tan lines. She's insecure about it.
Right.
And he's aware of that. So he builds her up in that. And I was thinking about that, Bethany Joy, and the question I would ask you is how did your dad, how did your dad help your mom in areas like that? Does anything come to your mind in relation to your mom and dad?
Well, my mom and dad were...
I don't know. Does your mom have insecurities?
That's what I was just thinking. I'm not sure that mom has insecurities. She's a very confident woman. But my dad was just very loving. He was always, always reassuring her of his love. And I think that's probably in the area of insecurities. Ways that we can speak to each other and speak life to each other is to speak to those insecurities and to build each other up and to reassure one another. I know today in our culture, there are lots of comparisons, as did Solomon's wife. She was comparing herself to the palace ladies, but we can compare ourselves to images on social media or on television and think, oh, goodness, I have 20 pounds overweight and I have gray hair or whatever. And our husbands, as my dad would do with my mom, oh my goodness, you're so beautiful and you're the woman for me. And he would talk about her from the pulpit. He was a pastor, and he would talk to his people and talk about how beautiful she was and what a good kisser she was and how he couldn't wait to be with her and how they just had this great relationship. And that's how I grew up. And so I really have had this wonderful background of knowing that you can speak reassurance to insecurities.
Sure. Bethany's dad was my pastor for 18 years, in the first 18 years of our marriage. And I remember that sometimes he would call her mother Hot Lips from the pulpit. And if he was talking about his wife, he'd say, my hot lips and I. And I always thought that was amazing that he would speak very public with his praise and very personal with his praise. And someone said along the way, as marriage talk necessarily becomes task-centric, we forget the language that made it pleasurable to begin with. And that's the language of love, of saying, I love you, of praising and building.
Right.
It's interesting in the text of Song of Solomon, chapter 1, verses 9 and following, that he starts personally. I have compared thee, I have. But in the 11th verse, he's talking in terms of we will. So he's conversing with somebody there. And one of the most important things we can do is always, always be positive about our spouse in public. That conveys our love.
Yes.
Some guys, always joke about the old lady and I. It's no way to talk about your wife. If you have an office, her picture should be on your desk. You should introduce her, even if she's not with you. I speak often all over the country, and when I stand to speak, if my wife's not in the audience, I introduce her. I tell people about her. I want people to know I'm happily married, and I'm married to someone I love very much, and I can't wait for you to meet this person that I love. And I'll do that at camps. I'll talk about my wife every service. And if I speak at some camps, I'll speak 10 or 12 or 13 times. Teenagers find it very disappointing if I stop. If I don't take a session to talk about my wife at the beginning of the message, they'll point it out and make a big deal about it. So as we're looking at Song of Solomon, talking about the art of communication, the first thing we're learning here is that he's very personal with his praise. He tells her she is loved, and he tells her she is lovely. And, any one of you can put that in practice right now. Mm-hmm. No matter what's going on in your life, you can work a little more on the I love you.
Right.
And you can work a little more on the encouragement, the I'm for you. I'm aware that, you feel awkward about this, but I want you to know that I think you're handsome, or I think you're gorgeous, or I love this about you.
Right.
And I remember that some years ago, I had a letter that came, and someone was kind of brutal about some issue involving my speaking. And they listed a number of issues that they thought that just absolutely horrible, and I needed to change them. But I remember a friend, God put a friend in my life that for several months he would text me or call me, not really texting back in those days, I guess, but he would call me or he would send me an email, and he would let me know the number of things that he liked about my preaching or my speaking. And those things that had become an insecurity because someone else had kind of ridiculed them, he turned them into a point of positive humor almost. Any one of us can build. We can be very personal and very public with our praise. And then we find here that she is very passionate about him. He does the talking in the first 3 verses, and she does the talking in the next ones, in which she is just building him up, and she tells him that while he's sitting at the table, she wants him to smell her spikenard. And she even says, "You're a bundle of myrrh unto me." And that's when we get this kind of awkward verse when we speak publicly. He shall lie all night betwixt my breasts. And I was speaking on that at one couples conference, and they had Twix candy bars as part of the table decor. And that became a real standing joke at this couples conferences. In fact, it was joked about so much that someone actually bought my wife and I Twix candy bar coffee mugs, matching travel coffee mugs based on these verses. And so she's just being very, very passionate about her praise for him, and very, very passionate. Bethany just mentioned to us even how her dad was that way. There's one more thing that we find here that we ought to talk about today, Bethany. And not only are they just saying, "I love you," and "you're lovely to me," and "I'm all passionate about you," but they did have problems that came up in the Song of Solomon. Mm-hmm. And in the chapter following here, the second chapter, we find an illustration that many of you know. It's a verse where they're talking about some problems, and they say, "Take us the foxes, the little foxes that spoil the vines, for our vines have tender grapes." In the time we have left, let's give some suggestions for talking about our problems. Because probably there are people listening to us right now, Bethany, and they have any number of issues in their marriage. So what advice would you give our audience about talking with their spouse about their problems?
Well, first of all, in the context here, they're talking about the little foxes. So these are the little day-by-day things that might come up. And first of all, I would say don't let them go if it's something that's building up in your heart. If it's something that comparatively you could say this is a little thing. He always leaves his socks on the floor right next to the laundry basket. Why can't he get it in the laundry basket? I don't know. So it's just building up in your heart. And every day you go in and you pick up those socks. First of all, I would say pray and ask the Lord to help you get over it. And just be like, you know what? I have a wonderful man who works hard, and he has stinky, smelly socks that need to be laundered because he works so hard. And so I'm going to pick them up and put them in the laundry basket, and I'm going to put them in the laundry. Maybe the Lord will help you to do that. Maybe the Holy Spirit will say, you know what? He could help you with this. And if you talk to him, then you can work out a plan about this. And so I would say, first of all, pray about it, see if you can get over it. If not, then find a good time. I think timing is really good.
That's very important, and I hope you'll listen to that real well. The timing of a discussion is important.
It's very important. If your husband's right in the middle of something, or if you are overwhelmed with something, you've had a really long day and you just feel like, wow, this day has been incredible and it can't get any worse. And there's my husband and I need to talk to him about this. Then it's all going to come out really wrong.
Yeah.
So timing is good. Praying about it is good. And then watching your tone of voice. The Bible tells us that a soft answer turns away wrath. And so not raising your voice and saying, why can't you put your socks in the laundry basket? just going to him and sweetly saying, hey, sweetheart, it would be a great help to me. Do you think maybe you could put your socks in the laundry basket instead of on the floor? And also, in the way I put that, in making it a question. Instead of accusing, you never do this.
That's really good.
Make it a question. Do you think you could help me with this? Or I've been struggling with this. Can you help me?
Yeah, accusations harden and open the door for an argument.
Yes.
But questions soften and open the door for a discussion.
Yes.
So that's really, really good. And by the way, for you that are listening, I do pick up my socks. That's
yes,
one
he
thing
does.
I do. So I'm so glad she chose that as an illustration, because that's one
off the wall.
That's the one that I don't have a problem with.
Example,
so hey,
yes.
I'm feeling pretty good about this right now.
That's hilarious.
So the point she's making here is really good. They're talking about small things. And it's always amazing that the Bible, I tell our kids quite frequently, it's always better to take care of a sin when it's small. And that's true of just the normal issues of life. Sometimes we let things go. Even anger is that way, because the Bible says that we're not to let the sun go down upon our wrath, meaning that if you don't take care of anger when it's tiny, it can become a habit of life, and it can become a damaging, devastating issue that you have to face and your family has to face and that people talk about when they may bring up your name. And so here they have a small issue. The little foxes that spoil the vines, for our vines have tender grapes. That's a reminder that our marriage relationships can be fragile.
Yes.
And all of us are sensitive about different areas. There are things that we're very strong about. Our friend, a pastor in Wisconsin, says that faults can be turned into endearments. Whereas Bethany's saying right there, you can become so frustrated every time you see those socks, or you can turn them into, this is the man I married, right, and make them something endearing. That brings our marriage relationship so much closer.
Yes.
And this is so extremely, extremely important. So there's some advice about talking with your spouse about the problems you face. And guys, I would even say to you, sometimes a man knows there's an issue and he doesn't want to say anything, or he doesn't feel that, I just don't know if she'll take it well. But communication here is the issue again, and timing is the matter. Scheduling it to say, hey, I want to talk to you sometime later this week, and maybe at this time we could talk, and I want to talk about something that's been concerning me. And you ask questions. You don't make an accusation. You can come in and say, what do you think about? Mm-hmm. And is this an area you think that we could do differently? Because I think I would prefer it differently. Questions are vital in dealing with these issues. Right. But sometimes in a problem in our marriage, we not only need to communicate with our spouse. Sometimes the problem is big enough that we need some advice for getting the help. We got to go outside the marriage and do some talking there. Yes. So, sweetheart, take a couple of moments and give our audience some advice about looking elsewhere for counsel. How do you talk about your issues in your marriage with other people? Give some advice there.
Well, in our culture, even in our Christian culture, in our churches, it is very popular and even accepted to just kind of blow steam to our friends and be like, oh, my word, this is my husband, or guys with their buddies, oh, my wife. And what we're looking for when you need help, when those little foxes have not been taken care of and they are starting to destroy the vine, when it becomes a big deal, you need counsel, not, as I heard one speaker say, not commiseration. I don't need my friends to come around me and be like, oh, yeah, right, I know, guys, or oh, my goodness,
that's really good.
Women, I can't understand them. No, you don't need that. You need counsel. You need someone that you can go to that you know is going to open the Word of God and not just give you their opinion, but give you what God says that can help your marriage.
That's really good. Well, Bethany Joy, our time is gone for this session, and this is part 2 of The Art of Marriage, or The Language of Love. And we'll be looking at some very practical advice next week, as well as we'll close out the third part of this session on communication. Well, our time is gone. This is Keeping It Young.
The Keeping It Young podcast is a Bax 5 Media production. All rights reserved.